Hi, everyone. We're back. Some of you maybe remember last week we had a lightning round with a lot of topics that we think are worth noting and thinking about in 2021 in the area of youth justice. But there's one topic that we decided we wanted to leave as a special session. Those of you who've been in our previous youth justice conferences know that we've often not done enough or explored enough the issue of Latinx youth, not to denigrate the fact that a big issue of discrimination and bias affects, of course, Black youth and Native American youth. But for this session, we wanted to make a special effort to look in depth at the issues that need to be looked at and reported in Latinx youth, which is why we've called this session Latinx Youth Undercounted and Ignored. And to take us through it, I first wanted to welcome our first panelist, Marcia Rincon-Gallardo, who will be speaking in general about some of the things that she's been working on as the co-founder and executive director of the Alianza for Youth Justice. Marcia also has a video that she wants to show us, so I will let her speak first and then introduce the video, and Chris, our stalwart producer, will get it on the air. Marcia, it's over to you. You can put on your video and your audio now. Hello, Marcia. Your audio is muted, so if you can unmute.
Okay, there. Can you hear me now?
We can. I can.
Oh, good. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Stefan. Thank you to the whole crew. I really just want to thank from at the very beginning, John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Center of Media, Crime and Justice for this invitation. I'm very much appreciative. I did want to first start with the video because it's a short 2 to 3 brief introduction to this report that I will be speaking about, our national report that we released in August. And then I'll go into my prepared comments. So I believe someone was going to cue that, and if we can get that going now, please.
Yes, we're cueing it now.
Thank you.
As it is our custom, we want to start by honoring our ancestors, the indigenous people of this land. For generations, the Latinx people have suffered cultural erasure, oppression, and systemic racism. The description of Latinx people include indigenous, Chicanos, Chicanas, LGBTQ, Mexicanos, Afro-Latinos, boys and girls, and all our relatives across the Caribbean and Central and South America. We have been living in segregated neighborhoods divided by class and income. Our youth have been disproportionately targeted by police and funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline. We are punished and pushed out of school at an alarming rate. At this stage of our life, we are exploring our environment, community, independence, searching for our identity. However, the reality is our youth must also navigate the social and racial inequities that are embedded in this white supremacist system. The system for decades has ensured Latinx youth remain invisible, from the moment there is police contact to court adjudication and ultimately upon entering and being released from youth prisons. This juvenile justice system does not recognize race, ethnicity via data. The collaboration by La Alianza for Youth Justice and UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative exposes a lack of uniformity in reporting race and ethnicity. The number of Latinx youth in the juvenile justice system is blurred. Quantitative and qualitative research shows Latinx youth are not consistently counted as Latinx youth, but instead are categorized as Black or white. No proper census is being provided to consistently know how many Latinx youth are in the system. Therefore, we are unable to advocate for appropriate and relevant resources to uplift the Latinx youth community that is system impacted. The data presented in this report is alarming. There is no uniformity in the system's policies across the states. Our elders have done this research. The presentations spent countless hours writing reports and advocated for systemic change. Yet 20 years later, we find nothing has evolved. The system must count Latinx youth as Latinx youth. For further information, connect with the Alianza's website and social media. Get involved. Aquí estamos y no nos vamos.
We will defend our youth and continue the fight to defund, dismantle, and end youth incarceration.
Thank you. Thank you for showing that. That was a video. I want to thank all of our colleagues over at MILPA, which is an organization of formerly system-impacted young people in Salinas, California. They helped us considerably in various ways, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But this video, it basically gives the foundation to then the report. But let me start first. I wanted to do just a little bit of demographics before I go into further comments. The general US population is 18% Latino, making them the nation's largest ethnic group. The Latinx youth population has increased by 158% between 1990 and 2018. Today, Latinx youth represent 25%, or about 8.3 million of the total US youth population between the ages of 10 to 17, which is that population that normally would be at the doorstep of the youth justice system, making Latinx the nation's youngest major racial ethnic group. Young Latinos are overwhelmingly US born, unlike what a lot of people think, which is that we're here illegally or undocumented. 94% of young Latinos under 18 are US born, and last, 7 in 10 of Latino youth under 18 years are of Mexican origin, followed by Caribbean, Central, and South American youth. The diversity of Latinx, which you saw in the video, includes youth whose parents and ancestors were born in what was once Mexico and now is the US, to youth whose parents or themselves come from Mexico, Central or South America, and from the Caribbean, making some of them to self-identify as Indigenous, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, Afro-Latinx, Hispanic, gender expansive, and from practically every single state in this country, including Alaska and Hawaii. Now, in 2002, Professor Francisco Villarroel, a current member of the Alianza, co-authored this seminal report on Latino youth in the youth justice system called Donde está la Justicia? You can find that on our website. 20 years later, in our recently released report, we are basically saying the same thing, which is that we've completed some work with the UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative in a report called Latinx Youth Data Gap in the Youth Justice System. The recommendations are at the end, and I'll talk about that, but here are some of our findings. We have known that Latinx youth are overrepresented in the justice system and receive harsher treatment than white youth. We also know that states have not been collecting accurate and complete data across all of the institutions within the youth justice system. Indigenous, Afro-Latino, Hispanic, brown girls, boys, and gender expansive youth face racial and ethnic inequities, and their invisibility impacts their exit from these unjust systems. As we manifest a society to end white supremacy and a country without youth in cages, our hope is that we can renew our focus on investing in young people, their families and community with healing and culturally centered approaches rather than funding structurally racist, broken, and ineffective systems. Every state and their counties must collect ethnic and racial data so that all our youth are counted and considered when developing policy. Collecting the data has consequence. Data matters because it impacts policy. Our report documents the difficulty calculating an accurate population estimate of Latinx youth across the youth and adult criminal justice systems. The lack of accurate racial ethnic data collection practices across the youth justice spectrum has limited our understanding of Latinx system impacted youth. With more consistent and racial and ethnic data, we can better determine how to allocate resources to downsize, defund, and close facilities to end the overrepresentation and disparities of Latinx youth in the system. Now, I could go on, but what I'd like to do is give you a couple of examples. The first one, in Santa Clara County, where I currently live, our youth court judge, Judge Catherine Lucero, courageously agreed to bring in Vera Institute's campaign to end incarceration for girls. Last week, we had 5 days of 0 girls in detention. It's a big win for us. Now, the population of Latinx youth in Santa Clara County is approximately 35%, with Latino youth in detention being at 70 to 80%. Now, when I first started doing this work, most conversations would end up talking about girls in general, and hardly ever would they mention Latinx girls. When I asked to see the data, because I was so curious, I realized that they had not been bringing data to the table to make decisions and to lead the work. When we actually got the data broken down by race and ethnicity, it was found that the majority of girls sitting in detention were in fact Latina. Prior to COVID, on any given day, we had 19 girls in detention. Last week, we were down to 0. Now, we realized that we could have not have done this without having that data broken down by race and ethnicity, because it drove how we did our policy changes, practice changes, and programmatic changes in order to decrease and end girls' incarceration in Santa Clara County. The second example I have is from a September 23rd, 2020 article in JDI Connect titled "Growing Numbers of Latino and Native Youth in Juvenile Detention Buck Trend." This article has nationwide data collected during the COVID era, and this trend would not have been uncovered without the breakdown of race ethnicity. The article states, in June and July, among jurisdictions that provided information disaggregated by race and ethnicity, white youth continued to be released from detention faster than youth of color. The gap favoring white youth has grown since before the pandemic began in February, particularly compared with Latino and Native American youth. In July, the release rate was 61% among white youth, compared with 55% among Black youth. The rate was 52% for Latino youth, and worse still, among Native American youth, it was 50%. Now, for those of us who work in local institutions, the unpacking to dive into why is this happening? Why is it that white youth get released more often than kids of color? Really needs to be looked at through data collection broken down by race, ethnicity, and SOGI, so that we can actually find the best practices and solutions. Instead of drawing your attention now to the recommendations in the report, which you can read on your own from looking for it on our website, I want to spend the rest of my little bit of time providing you some key points to watch for that can make or break your magnifying the reporting on Latinx youth and ending mass incarceration for all of our youth. 1, Latinx youth are part of the other youth of color. What I mean is name us, be intentional to break out and define who you're speaking to when you say youth of color. Stop lumping us all into the youth of color category. There is a long-standing black-white binary in the literature that uses the term youth of color, yet whom this mostly means is Black youth versus white youth, and Latinx youth are erased and not mentioned. There is no data mentioned in the literature and no images of our youth. While we support fully the work of Black Lives Matters, we also want to address the unique oppression and racism that exists uniquely for Latinx youth. 2, if you are going to use data to speak of youth of color, use raw numbers and/or percentages along with rates. When you only use rates, people walk away seeing that Black rates are off the hook as we should be looking at them. And yet they walk away saying there is no problem with Latino youth and we don't need to focus on Latino youth. Yet let me give you the example of why this matters. Again, an example of Santa Clara County. Probation and other national organizations that work to support reform here mostly use rates to show data of race, ethnicity of youth of color. Yet we know that while Black youth represent 3% here, the population in Santa Clara County, they are found in detention at an alarming 11% and a rate of 5 times that of white youth. For Latino youth, who represent 35% of the population and found in detention at 75% and a rate of 2 to 3 times that of white youth, you walk away saying, oh, there's not an issue going on with Latino youth. So to show only rates would alarmingly call attention to Black youth and walk away from being able to look and dig deeper when the volume of kids sitting in detention are actually Latino youth. 3, there are important intersectionalities that make unpacking and conducting important investigative research on our youth to be successful on reporting about Latinx youth in the youth justice system. These intersectionalities, which I'll only mention but not go into, is items such as generational characteristics, such as first immigrant generation versus fifth generation Chicano. There's different ways and approaches. 2, then issues of SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and last but not least, geography. Latinos, the differences between them from the East Coast versus West Coast and Southwest. Last, we cannot program our way out of mass incarceration. In other words, whereas the system may think that more programs is what will get Latinx youth out of detention, we know that in fact, it's about changing policy and practices within the system, along with culturally and healing-centered services that will get Latinx to successfully exit the system. You must report and offer the solutions besides just programming. Okay, this is where I'm gonna stop. There is so much more to say, yet I will stop with the 101 version, and next time I come, I can go into 201. I wanna thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Marcia. We do have some questions already, so you'll be able to follow up with when you answer those questions. Let me bring onto the screen Holly Cooper. She's going to talk a bit more about a lecture from the UC Davis School of Law, and she's going to speak to the specific issue of immigration, which of course we've all been reading about for the last several years, and how it impacts of Latinos, of both young Latinos and of course adult Latinos. And it's important, obviously, still to concentrate, but I'm glad that we had Marcia on first, because it showed that the issue really is much wider than immigration in the U.S. And that's one of the things that we wanted to point out when we're talking about the need for changes and reforms in youth justice. So Holly, the gavel is yours. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Marcia, for your wonderful comments. I'm very humbled to be on this panel, and thank you for inviting me. I just wanted to say thank you to the journalists for the last 4 years, because I don't think maybe you do, but maybe you don't realize how much power you have in the solution to Latinx being ignored. And you're not the only solution, but you're one of them, because I've been working with immigrants, youth in particular, in detention for 25 years. And before the Trump administration, I was next to impossible to get anybody to cover the story of Border Patrol abuses, incarceration of youth. And after the Trump administration took office, I got between 10 to 500 calls per day. So I think it's really important for us to keep the stage centered on this issue despite a possible change in administration. Because the issue has always been present and will persist, as Marcia noted, and it has persisted for decades, if not centuries, in this country. So, and also it's really important to cultivate your relationships, because not just to dive in when the issue becomes hot. And I can give you a couple examples. Is that throughout my career, I've been banging on journalist doors to cover the story. Down the street from me was a youth detention center where kids were staying between 3 to 4 years incarcerated, and they weren't letting them out. Immigration wasn't letting them out. And I couldn't get anybody to cover the story except for one journalist, right? And she did, and it was before, Trump took office. And then, because of the privilege of access that I have to youth throughout the United States, in my capacity as a lawyer, I have access to any youth who's incarcerated by Immigration or Border Patrol anywhere in the United States. And when we went in to visit, our legal team went in to visit the Border Patrol cages, and we saw children packed into cells without food, without shampoo, children who were infants being held by non-related 7-year-olds. It was, one of the worst conditions that our legal team had seen. Of course, I contacted the journalist that we trusted, and she blew open the story, and it was probably one of the biggest, most impactful stories, I think, on immigration in the last 4 years, was the story in the youth in cages, which has always been an issue, but it became such an issue that we witnessed children dying. So I think that, those cultivation of relationships long term will yield you the story that you want, that will, could possibly break open, and change fundamentally, which is what I hope you're all here for, is we want to change the policy. We want to change laws by building narratives. And so I think the cultivation of relationships is key. One issue I see persistently with journalists that call me is they want visuals. And I understand that. I think that storytelling with visuals and the voices of the impacted and the oppressed is the number one way to change policy. With detention, it's very difficult because, only certain people have access. The oppressed have access. So, so some of the solutions that we've been able to think through are, doing phone calls from detention centers with journalists, also doing the Freedom of Information Act requests, both state and federal, to get video footage inside of the detention centers. Some other things I've seen journalists do very creatively are using audios of inside of the detention facilities. Some other things that lawyers have done is obviously sue to get the information, and to also have kids draw what they're seeing inside, which, as the New York Times did a big piece on the visuals that the children we met with had done of the inside of the detention facility and what it looked like visually to them to be separated from parents. So get really creative with your visuals, because they're not going to allow you to go in and film unless there's a systemic call for change to have more visibility. Because part of I don't think the community is voiceless. We're making them as a society so you can't see them, right? So you have to pry open that access, and have policy changes where we're making these detention facilities more visible to the journalists. Also, I would say, in terms of who is the storyteller? Make sure it's not us, the lawyers, the storyteller, right? You want to make sure that you're really careful on who's telling the story and and making sure it's the people who are affected that are doing the storytelling. And the other thing is one of the biggest tragedies I saw was that there's a real lack of Latinx, significant news sources hiring Latinx journalists or bilingual journalists. And this issue was really brought to a head for me was when they gave access to certain journalists to go into the CBP cages to interview, and there wasn't a single journalist who went in there that was bilingual. And what a missed opportunity that was. And that's really the fault of the major news organizations to have done that. And it was a big travesty. And I know that it's not about your ego, it's about getting the story, and about, in order to do that, you have to be smart about who you're sending in and who you're hiring. And also, and so there's that, and also just cultivating relationships so that you're not always coming to the lawyers to find the community members who are affected. You should be reaching out to organizations like Marcia's, organizational leaders, people in the community that have the impacted community's trust. Because lawyers, we receive so many calls per day that we're not going to have the time to call our client and to cultivate the story for you. Oftentimes we can make the time, but it's very difficult, especially when we're getting, at least 10 calls per day. So So that's another thing is to be really careful on how you present a story. Lawyers and community advocates and grassroots organizers, we're very well organized on journalists. We have blacklists on journalists. So when you're doing a piece and you burn our client or you burn the narrative, that may be what you intended to do. But just know that we're very well organized and we have communications amongst all of us about which journalists to trust. And we take it very seriously. One example would be, we worked with a mother whose child, who was a toddler, died in a family detention facility, and the journalist really burned the narrative and went against and basically, didn't provide culpability on the detention center when we had experts saying it was. So I don't think there's a immigration advocate that'll ever talk to that journalist again. So also kind of keep that in mind. Maybe there's a reason you want to burn your source, but I think that playing the government apologist and also the language you use can also put you on the blacklist. I think language in your storytelling is super important. I see a lot of journalists calling these immigration detention facilities shelters, and really kind of, softening the blow of really what they are and sort of doing the government's bidding. Or it's really obvious to us as advocates and lawyers and organizers is to who is really the shill for the government. And so kind of keep that in mind as that we're tracking how the story is ultimately produced and keeping like a running, Google Doc on which journalists are actually telling the truth. So that's it. And I guess, some of the things to keep in mind as journalists, especially if you're a white journalist, is we see a lot of journalists appropriating stories from journalists from the Latinx community or even books. And so it's been a real plague of the in this community. A lot of my, in the last 4 years, I've become very close with a lot of journalists because immigration's been in the news every day. With that too, I think that one of the other things I would keep in mind as a journalist covering immigration issues, because that's primarily where I work. I work on just the issues of the intersectionality between prison, detention, and the criminal and justice system. And I think that, one of the issues we see is that journalists are calling us, very undereducated on the issue. And I can spend between 2 to 3 hours a day educating journalists on issues. But, you're not, again, it's about cultivating resources. When you're coming to me already educated, then I'm, kind of putting you in the good journalist box. But when you're coming to me, asking me the difference between the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and you don't know which arm of the government is detaining unaccompanied minors versus, family detention camps, you're going to cost me like another hour of my day in explaining that to me. So I think that, just kind of keep those in mind. And I think that but we are very thankful to you because I think that you really are a powerful force in change in this country. And we appreciate your hard work. And I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Let me follow up quickly with you, Holly, on before I go into questions. Since we're looking ahead at 2021 and a new administration, and as you suggest, I guess that there won't be as much attention paid as there was during the Trump years. What should journalists be looking at? What are the key stories that really should be looking at in terms of the work you do in the immigration portfolio? Maybe 2 or 3 would be a help, and then we can get into a conversation.
Sure. I mean, I think that our fear as immigrant rights advocates is that we're going to believe that Biden has cured the issue when it's not, because what we saw under Obama was many of the same policies not, executed with as much vitriol. But we saw the family detention. The kids who were being indefinitely detained was under the Obama administration, right? Down the street from me, and nobody cared. So I think that our fear is that all these issues are going to be ignored again because we're not going to want to sort of troll, so to speak, the Biden administration too early. But I think we have to come out with force and hold them just as accountable as we held the Trump administration on these issues because the children in cages, they're still there. The detention system that we have, the apparatus, the largest in the world, is still going to be there under Biden. And so I think we really need to make sure that that we're appreciating that. And I think that we also need to really be talking about climate change in its relationship with race and incarceration and migration. And I think that most journalists really bypass that issue to the extent that it's going to define the world for the next, 4 years. And so forever. But I think it's super important. It's often ignored.
Marcia, let me toss that question to you as well. We have one question from Ronald Burler about the 2020 census, who asked whether there's a useful possible workaround to it. But before answering that one, I wonder if you could just focus a little bit on the stories that need to be talked about and written about and broadcast as we move into a new year and a new administration.
Certainly. So we're preparing ourselves to put on our roller skates and move in quickly because the issues of criminal justice, especially on the adult side, have been high impact, lots of people talking about it, that we want to be able to uplift the issues regarding youth justice, and particularly the successes we're having. There is huge successes all over the country regarding closing down of institutions and finding alternatives to incarceration in communities. And we want to really elevate and push the bar, especially with a Democratic administration. One thing that I want to mention, because this happens a lot, is in most workshops that I do at a national level, they end up putting immigration along with us, right? Talking about youth justice. And what I want to mention, while I really support that this topic of immigration is hot and we need to address it, we need to end the separation of families and the caging of young people. We also want to make sure that the reporters and journalists know that the majority of Latinos sitting in detention facilities around the country are not because they're gang members and not because they're undocumented. I wrote a blog about this because whenever we mention Latino youth to anybody, the first thing that comes to mind is that Latino youth are in detention for violent crimes, for gang-related activity, and because they're undocumented, and that's false. All over this country, kids of color sit in detention for low-level offenses. And the majority of these kids, like I said before, are US-born Latino kids. And so, I think I want to agree with what Dr. Cooper Hawley mentioned, which is do your homework. There's organizations that really know what's going on. Reach out to us, read up on things, come up with some questions. It's going to be 4 years where we're really going to push the dial to get some advances. The research is showing us that closing down facilities and doing community-based, healing-centered, culturally relevant services is the approach, but the power and funding to do that needs to shift along with it. There was a great series, by the way, by Jill Tucker and Joaquin Palomino out of San Francisco Chronicle, as well as Karen DeStaw. She's done a lot of really good work. Look up their information regarding the youth justice system. They did a fabulous series. And we just want to, help, because we believe that what you guys do is so critical to get the word out.
So one of the difficulties, we've learned this obviously since the election, is that looking at the Latinx community as one single community is wrong, culturally, for one thing. But I'm wondering if you could give us some pointers about how to differentiate if there's a reason to, the different challenges and obstacles we face in the different Latinx communities, youth communities around the country. Whether, what affects Latinx youth in Miami is very different from what affects similar youth in New Mexico or California.
Absolutely. I travel all over this country. I've had the honor to do that into different detention facilities. And I have to say that I usually walk in and I have to ask young people to self-identify. That's really where we start. Centering formerly system-impacted young people, and not just only asking them for their story. They bring a lot of expertise to the table. So we've been doing a lot of leadership development so that their voice and their participation is at the center of all this work. And so going to young, formerly system impacted young people and asking them how to self-identify is key. And you're correct. East Coast versus West Coast, so much started on the East Coast that frames everything. And by the time it gets to us on the West Coast, we're like, that doesn't work for us, people. And so in terms of reporting, being really clear to get that diversity, right? So gender expansive youth are 50% in California of the kids that sit, particularly girls that sit in detention, it's 50% are gender expansive. Across the country, it's 40%. We have to get that voice, along with the Afro-Latino voice, the voices of Central American. Now, yes, the majority is Latino, Mexican youth, Chicano, different generations, first to fifth generation and so forth. But there are these other pockets of Dominican, Boricua, Central American youth that are finding their way into these systems instead of community-based services.
Are there major legislative changes or movements in the works around the country that specifically would deal with Latinx youth?
Well, we were here in California. I sponsored a bill with then Assemblywoman Nora Campos. It was AB 1998, which was signed by Governor Brown. So this is dated, right? Where we wanted to mandate that every single county count Latinos as Latinos. And it got watered down mainly by the Association of Chiefs of Probation, who said that it was going to cost them way too much money to try to count Latinos as Latinos. And I disagree with that. But it did get watered down to recommend that counties count Latinos as Latinos. So anyway, all that to say that at the federal level through the OJJDP Act, the JJDPA Act, I'm sorry, it has the language, but it isn't being, what is the word? It isn't being followed, accounted for or held accountable. The states aren't being held accountable. We're going to be working towards assuring that we count Latinos as Latinos. And there's going to be other things as well, but that one is the first thing that needs to get passed.
Right. So I guess that responds in part to Ron Broder's question about ways to get around the suppression of the data.
Right. So in response to that, because I know that it was very specific to the census, I have to say that the current way that this census asked is not what we recommend. It was during Obama's administration that the Census Bureau had developed a very they had gone through a lot of research to come to the, it was the approach of asking and being able to mark various boxes about your identity. Most people from a country of origin, let's say El Salvador, will say they're Salvadoran. They won't say Latinx, they won't say Hispanic. Right. So you really have to give that option with race and ethnicity combined that then gets you the best results. And so we're hoping that with this Democratic administration that we'll be able to come back to counting in the way that the Census Bureau had so successfully come up with this methodology.
So Holly, maybe the time we have left, do you want to chime in on, the data needs that we still have in terms of following the immigration story? Where do you think the holes are, and what can journalists do to try to plug them and find out more information?
Yeah, I think a lot of what is really interesting about immigration is how many untruths were given to us, and I think that even the federal judges are now sort of, we used to go into court and no one would believe us as advocates or the voices of the people we represented when we presented the atrocities. But I think that the federal judiciary is really becoming aware of how often the federal government lies and misrepresents the data. And, this has really come to a head with the rendering of the children who have been held in the motels and deporting them without any sort of accountability. And so a lot of the questions we're going to have under a new administration are going to be, what was the truth? How many children were separated from parents? How many immigrants were deported without ever having those numbers be visible and presented to us? So I'm going to be really curious to see how the Biden administration responds to the Freedom of Information Act requests and whether they create visibility, perhaps even truth commissions or congressional hearings on the matters, because I think there's a lot that we do not know about what happened, because we're already seeing the federal courts heavy mistrust on the data that's being represented in court. And so that, I think that the new frontier is going to be to resubmit all of those requests so that we know what actually happened, because it's so important for us to hold history and to hold ourselves as a country and as white people accountable for the past. And we, and I think that we're going to have this tendency to sort of jump over and like want to heal, but you can't have healing without an accountability of what happened. And I think that that's the story that needs to be told.
And it's an open question. What happened to those 535 kids that we still don't know about?
And it was more than 534, I'll tell you that right now.
So we have about 4 minutes or so left before ending this session, and I don't see any other questions in my Q&A box. So I'd like to have each of you close, perhaps, with telling us a few minutes about some of the programs that you see that are really ones that you would. I mean, Marcia talked about the one in Santa Clara, but any of the programs you see around the country that really offer solutions, as opposed to just looking at the problems. And I'm anticipating here a little bit Tina Rosenberg, who's going to be talking about solutions journalism in general in our roundtable. But if you guys could sort of earmark for us some of the things that you think or programs or best practices that you see around the country that are worth following up. Marcia, maybe you can go first, and we'll give it over.
Sounds good. So we know that, like I said earlier, that centering formally system-impacted, directly experienced individuals in the work of dismantling and ending incarceration is key. There's an organization by the name of MILPA out of Salinas, California, Monterey County, that has been doing some fabulous work. They now sit at they attend a lot of state work, which was part of the work that closed DJJ. And then they also participate in a lot of national policy work. So that's where I think having that power of formally system experienced individuals to be able to drive dismantling of the system and ending incarceration is key.
Yeah, I mean, the best practice in terms of, I mean, I don't know, that's a broad question. I don't know if in terms of journalists, but the best practices that I see in journalism are when I'm working with somebody that really understands and takes the time to understand all of what, Marcia is trying to unpackage for us, which is the systemic biases that lead to the over-incarceration of Latinx youth. Because I think if you just take the data and you spit it back out, we're in a sense recriminalizing Latinx youth, and they're starting to believe this narrative. And I think that once we have to take a step back and not, once we're talking about the over-incarceration, we can't talk about that with talking about how they're over-arrested. All the systems in play within the police state are over-incarcerating them because they're over-arresting them. They're placing them in foster care at higher rates. And all of this is wrong. And it's because of systemic racism that we're doing these things. But if we're just kind of spitting out the narrative without unpackaging why we're at where we're at, and I agree, Marcia, that like Karen DeSaw is like phenomenal. She's one of the journalists that we trust the most in the immigrant rights community, along with Out Abogado, along with a lot of other wonderful journalists. And it's really because she takes the time to understand the system that got us here. So the best practice for journalism is to do that and to understand the language you're using as well, and to really not fall prey to how our government is trying to criminalize youth and in particular Latinx youth. I work a lot with Indigenous youth, and I think that's overlooked a lot as well.
Yes.
I would say most of the immigrants coming to this country that I work with are Indigenous,
So
and they don't speak Spanish, So I think that that's also something that may be overlooked as well.
if I could squeeze in one last question, which just came across my transom, it's from Judy Ellich, and she wants to know how those in the media in the digital age who are required to write and respond to what readers want to know, get individuals who are interested in more in-depth pieces of themes that run deep into the culture we live. And that's, of course, a question that each of you could answer, I'm sure, in a half hour or a day. But if it's a question of, one of the things I think that we should be flagging to try to get further and deeper into the issues that affect Latinx youth. Marcia, maybe answer a few moments, and then Holly, you can close.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to echo what Holly said earlier, which is building relations. And that's definitely what we're trying to do, is really expand how many reporters, journalists out there will take the time to work with us, see us, how we open up our meetings now. We don't just go, they're not transactional relationships, they're building relationships, which include opening and closing with, some level of recognition of our ancestors and the land that we're on. So it's a different paradigm. And so when you do that, you're able to really learn about how these systems impact our lives, and that we're not doing this just because, that we're actually doing it because it's about survival. And thriving, really thriving as a people, intact and whole and sacred. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Marcia. That was well put. So Holly, 1 minute for you, and then we'll close the session.
Okay. I mean, I think part of the problem I hear from a lot of my journalist friends is that the newsrooms themselves are not ethnically and racially balanced. And so when you have the editors, who are just sort of the old systems in place, then I think that's going to be harder to get your story through. Because I've seen the edited stories, I've seen them before edit and after edit. So I think we also have to take a look at the journalism, especially the big journalist, empires like MSNBC and CNN. Oftentimes the people on the immigration beat aren't from the impacted communities. So I think that to me is one of the biggest problems we need to confront.
Can I just say, Stefan, that a lot of people think that Latinos only watch Spanish media. And so the CNNs of the world, the usual suspects, they don't even have reporters that look like me. And so because they don't mention us, then I think there's a lot of readers that don't even come to participate, right? Because if we don't see ourselves reflected, then we don't want to participate. We don't see that the issues you're discussing are going to relate to us. And so that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. I think I was disconnected for a while, but I'm now back. So thank you both, Holly and Marcia. And anybody who has other questions, please send them to me in an email, and I will send them to both of our distinguished speakers, and they will answer separately, and I'll send it around to everyone. So we'll take now a 10-minute break. Thank you both, and we'll come back for our last panel of the day. Thank you.